Strategy, a History by Lawrence Friedman, published by Oxford. Strategy as Profession and Product. If we consider strategy to be a particular sort of practical problem solving, it has existed since the start of time. Even if the word was not always in use, we can now look back and observe how personalities engaged in activities that would later be called strategy. Did the arrival of a word to capture this activity make an important difference to the actual practice? Even after its introduction, strategy was not universally employed as a descriptor, even by those who might now be considered accomplished strategists. What was different was the idea of strategy as a general body of knowledge from which leaders could draw. The strategist came to be a distinctive profession, offering specialist advice to elites, and strategy became a distinctive product reflecting the complexity of situations in which states and organizations found themselves. We noted earlier the role of the strategos in 5th century Athens. According to Edward Luttwak, the ancient Greek and Byzantine equivalent to our strategy would have been strategica epistema, general's knowledge, or strategon sophia, general's wisdom. This knowledge took the form of compilations of stratagems, as in the Strategematon, the Greek title of the Latin work by Frontinus. The Greeks would have described what was known about the conduct of war as tactica techne, which included what we call tactics as well as rhetoric and diplomacy. The word strategy only came into general use at the start of the 19th century. Its origins predated Napoleon and reflected the Enlightenment's growing confidence in empirical science and the application of reason. Even war, the most unruly of human activities, might be studied and conducted in the same spirit. This field of study at first was known as tactics, a word that had for some time referred to the orderly organization and maneuver of troops. Tactics, defined as the science of military movements, could, according to Beatrice Heuser, be traced back to the 4th century BCE. There was no corresponding definition of strategy until an anonymous 6th century work linked it explicitly with the general's art. Strategy is the means by which a commander may defend his own lands and defeat his enemies. In 900, the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI wrote of strategia to provide an overall term for the business of the strategos. A few centuries later, there was some knowledge of Leo's work, but when in 1554 a Cambridge professor translated the text into Latin, which lacks a word for strategy, he used the art of the general or the art of command. In 1770, Jacques-Antoine Hippolyte Comte de Guibert published his Essai général de tactique. Then only 27, Guibert was a precocious and extravagant French intellectual who had already acquired extensive military experience. He produced a systematic treatise on military science that captured the spirit of the Enlightenment and gained enormous influence. At issue was whether it was possible to overcome the indecisiveness of contemporary war. Guibert's view was that achieving a decisive result with a mass army required an ability to maneuver. He distinguished elementary tactics, which became tactics, from grand tactics, which became strategy. Guibert wanted a unified theory, raising tactics to the science of all times, all places, and all arms. His key distinction was between raising and training armies, and then using them in war. By 1779 he was writing of La Stratégique. The sudden introduction of the word is attributed by Heuser to Paul Gédéon Joly de Mézeroy's translation of Leo's book into French in 1771. Joly de Mézeroy identified Leo's science of the general as being separate from the subordinate spheres of tactics. In a footnote he observed, La stratégique is thus properly said to be the art of the commander to wield and employ appropriately and with adroitness all the means of the general in his hand, to move all the parts that are subordinate to him, and to apply them successfully. By 1777, a German translation of the work used the term strategy, or strategie. Joly de Mézeroy described strategy as sublime, a word also used by Guibert, and involving reason more than rules. There was much to consider. Quote, in order to formulate plans, strategy studies the relationships between time, positions, means, and different interests, and takes every factor into account, which is the province of dialectics, that is to say of reasoning, which is the highest faculty of the mind. End quote. The term now began to achieve a wide currency, offering a way of inserting deliberate, calculating thought into an arena previously remarkable for its absence. In Britain, from the start of the 19th century, a plethora of words emerged. Strategimatic, stratematical, stratagematist, stratagemical, all sought to convey the idea of being versed in strategies and stratagems. Thus a strategemator would devise stratagems, while a stratarchy referred to the system of rule in an army, starting with the top commander. This word was once used by British Prime Minister William Gladstone to refer to how armies would go beyond hierarchy to require absolute obedience to superior officers. Then there was stratarithmetry, which was a way of estimating how many men you had by drawing up an army or body of men into a given geometrical figure. An alternative word for strategist was strategian, which goes neatly with tactician, though this did not catch on. The distinction between strategy and tactics was of acknowledged importance as a means of distinguishing between different levels of command and contact with the enemy. The strategy was the art of the commander-in-chief, projecting and directing the larger military movements and operations of a campaign, while tactics was the art of handling forces in battle or in the immediate presence of the enemy. Soon the word migrated away from its military context and into such diverse areas as trade, politics, and theology. The speed with which the word strategy gained currency meant that it came to be used without a generally agreed upon definition. There was a consensus that strategy had something to do with the supreme commander, and that it was about linking military means to the objects of war. It involved making connections between all that was going on in the military sphere beyond the more immediate and small-scale maneuvers and encounters handled at the lower levels of command. But the activities that came under the heading of strategy were also understood to be intensely practical, a consequence of the sheer size of the armies of the New Age, the extraordinary demands posed by their movement and provisioning, and the factors that would govern how enemies should be approached. Much of this might be subject to forms of practical knowledge and principles that could be described in a systematic and instructive way, with checklists of considerations to be taken into account by the more forward-looking commanders. It is not surprising, therefore, that strategy became closely associated with planning. Questions of supply and transport limited what could be achieved, and calculations of firepower and fortification influenced decisions on the deployment of troops. Put this way, strategy covered all those aspects of a military campaign that might properly be determined in advance. Improved maps made an enormous difference to planning of this sort. Developments in cartography meant that it was possible to consider how a campaign might develop by plotting its likely course on sheets of paper, representing base camps and lines of supply, enemy positions, and opportunities for maneuvers. A start had been made on the reconceptualization of war in spatial terms by a Henry Lloyd, who had left Britain because of his participation in the Jacobite rebellion of 1745, and then fought with a variety of European armies. Having observed that those who embraced the profession of arms took little or no pains to study it, he claimed to have identified fixed principles of war that could vary only in their application. Lloyd is credited with inventing the term line of operations, which remains in use to this day and describes an army's path from its starting point to its final destination. Lloyd influenced subsequent military theorists, including the Prussian Heinrich Dietrich von Bülow, who went to France in 1790 to experience the revolution firsthand. Having studied Napoleon's methods, he wrote on military affairs, including a practical guide to strategy, in 1805. He got somewhat carried away by the possibilities of geometric representations of armies preparing for battle. His reliance on mathematical principles led to him to offer proofs on how armies might constitute themselves and move forward, according to distances from their starting base and enemy objective. The approach can be discerned from his definition of strategy as, quote, all enemy movements out of the enemy's cannon range or range of vision, end quote, so that tactics covered what happened within that range. His observations on tactics were considered to have merit, but much to his chagrin, his description of the new war system was ignored by Prussian generals. Whatever the scientific method might bring to the battlefield, when it came to deciding on the moment, form, and conduct of battle, much would depend on the general's own judgment, perhaps more a matter of character, insight, and intuition than careful calculation and planning. When battle was joined, the theory could say little because of the many variables in play, and at that point war became an art form. Strategy could be considered a matter of science in the sense of being systematic, empirically based, and logically developed, covering all those things that could be planned in advance and were subject to calculation. As art, strategy covered actions taken by bold generals who could achieve extraordinary results in unpromising situations.